Good evening, and welcome to Chrononauts, a science fiction literature history podcast. I'm Nate, and I'm joined by my co-hosts Gretchen and JM. And tonight we're going to be doing something maybe a little bit different than we've done before on the podcast. But before we get into all of that, you can find us on all of the major podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple and Google. And we also post our episodes onto YouTube if that platform is more convenient for you. We also run a blog spot at chrononautspodcast.blogspot.com where we post hard to find and rare text as well as original translations of works that haven't been translated into English before.
Yeah, we have some cool translations coming up.
We do, yeah. There's some interesting stuff on the blog spot that we posted recently. One from Ukrainian, this very anti-capitalist Atlantis story that's short but fun to read. And there's some definitely interesting stuff in the future, so keep an eye on that. You can also follow us on Twitter at ChrononautsSF or on Facebook at facebook.com/ChrononautsPodcast. But for tonight, we are a literature podcast, and we really haven't delved into other forms of science fiction media, aside from a few movies here and there that happen to be adaptations of the works that we're covering in a particular episode.
We keep bringing in the movie talk, and we even snuck in a music episode once, so...
Yeah.
We do diverge every now and then.
Yeah, but there is certainly a whole nother realm of science fiction media that is unrelated, you could say, to the literature that we've been covering. Something that stands alone from literature adaptations, though, as we'll see in a bit, there are quite a bit of those throughout the entire history of where science fiction media starts to diverge from literature. So in the last 3 episodes we've done on the show, starting with our Astounding the Early Days episode, we've been taking a look at the rise of science fiction fandom in the United States, mostly through the lens of Astounding magazine. But we also take a look at the rise of fanzine culture, conventions, and fanfiction. And this episode can be seen as both a continuation of our discussion on fanfiction, in that the works we're covering tonight are not self-published stories by amateurs, but rather officially published novels that are commissioned by the intellectual property holders of the franchise. And this can also be seen as a representation of science fiction expanding into other mediums. So for the first several centuries of science fiction adjacent works broadly construed, literature was really the only medium for science fiction. I suppose the stage is kind of a slightly different medium than the page, but since a lot of drama does get published in book form, I think it's close enough to count. And we've covered a couple plays on the podcast before, though certainly not a great deal.
We certainly have.
But this all starts to change in several key points. One around the mid to late 1890s with the introduction of film. The next in the late 1920s, early 1930s with the emergence of comics, talkie film serials, and radio series, which also coincides with the launch of Amazing Stories and the American pulp science fiction magazine market. And the next major turning point, which we'll be talking tonight, is the late 1950s, early 1960s, where science fiction for adults comes into the picture on the television market. And I don't want to present a very in-depth history of these forms of media, but rather, I want to throw out a few book titles for those who are interested in exploring this a little bit more in depth, as well as give our own recommendations here for some of these early titles. So everybody feel free to chime in for some of the stuff that you enjoy from this time period. So I think for a general reference work on early science fiction film, Michael Benson's Vintage Science Fiction Films from 1896 to 1949 is incredibly comprehensive. It's one of those books that are a chronological description of like every movie ever made and should be laid out like the Blyler books, but instead it's kind of forced into a narrative format, which has a little bit of readability
So what
issues.
exactly do you mean by that narrative format? Like it tries to make a case for what exactly?
Just how it's like laid out and structured. Like the Blyler book, there's like sections cut off for like each individual work. Where,
it's more of a linear structure, right, than like alphabetical?
Yeah, right, exactly. So he tries to do it in chronological order, but it's not like he sections off like each movie, like he's talking about that. He kind of like tries to weave it into more paragraph format. I don't know. I guess when you take a look at it, you'll see what I mean. It's definitely has a ton of information in there, but it's definitely a little bit dense. And for a work that is laid out like it, in my opinion, should be more of like a reference format. It doesn't contain like a lot of overarching historical narrative, which is, I guess what you would expect for a book in a format like that.
Yeah.
But if you're looking to mine for some real obscurities, this book contains, again, a massive, massive amount of information. And for the early days of science fiction film, that is the silent era, it's probably worthwhile to mention that a good chunk of these films are adaptations of novels. So there's a lot of Jules Verne, especially in composite and parody form in Méliès films. So some of the titles that find their way into some of these movies are From the Earth to the Moon and the Around the Moon sequel, Journey Through the Impossible, 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, numerous adaptations of that one, Journey to the Center of the Earth, The Adventures of Captain Hatteras, The Sphinx of the Ice Realm, and Mysterious Island. Some of those we've covered on the podcast. Likewise with H.G. Wells, there's adaptations of First Men on the Moon and The Invisible Man, and other novels include Alita, Queen of Mars, Metropolis, Frankenstein, Doyle's Lost World, Women in the Moon, and probably a couple others that I'm missing. So we've covered a fair amount of these on the podcast, and we'll definitely cover some of the other ones. But interesting to note how early on the two worlds are really linked with one another.
Yeah, I haven't read too much about the really old film period and stuff like that. Or even the really old science fiction radio serials, even though I like radio serials. As for the 50s stuff, I do have one. I guess it's also a rough recommendation with a caveat, and I guess the caveat is it's not really that well. I don't know. It's just not that well written or put together a book, but it still has a lot of useful information in it and clued me into a couple things that I didn't know about. And it's also from a British perspective, which is cool because usually you see this kind of stuff from the American perspective, and
Right.
this pertains to the 1950s, which we're going to talk about very shortly. So it's kind of misleadingly called The Golden Age of Science Fiction, and the subtitle is A Journey into Space with 1950s radio, TV, films, comics, and books, and it's written by John Waite. And yeah, that's a very inclusive title, and I don't think he quite manages to, I guess, capture everything that he's trying to take up in one fell swoop in this book, but it's still pretty useful. Especially it's got a really good chapter on British science fiction radio series, and that's an area that I didn't really know too much about previously. There's the TV stuff with Quatermass and all that, but radio is something that I didn't really know if there was science fiction on the radio in Britain earlier or what. So it talks about Journey to Space, which actually I didn't know about, but there's also stuff called The Lost Planet and some other cool stuff that was on the radio at the time. And unlike the American shows, like the really good American sci-fi shows from that time, these were serials.
Yeah, I haven't really listened to any of the radio stuff, but it might be something interesting to cover later. Certainly the scene explodes around the 1950s, and before that is definitely an interesting progression of not a whole lot, and to just see that kind of exponential growth through the 20s, 30s, 40s, and then onto the 50s, where
in the 50s was already kind of past the golden age of radio.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because, I mean, you had a lot of suspense and thriller shows in the 30s and 40s, but all the science fiction shows seemed like they were kind of juvenile.
Yeah, like Flash Gordon and the Buck Rogers and stuff like that. Yeah.
I mean, I would argue that the thrillers and stuff kind of sometimes felt that way too, but I think it was unintentional, just kind of it's just silly dialogue and different things that kind of make you chuckle a little bit. And now listening to them in retrospect, a lot of the time the advertising is actually part of the show itself, so you can hear all the cool, weird old advertisements and stuff.
Right,
Always fun. Just like in our Astounding episode.
Perhaps the ads done a little more smoothly than sometimes they were in those pulp magazines.
Yeah, exactly.
Certainly for the early days of science fiction film, there's not a whole lot as far as runtime goes. A lot of the pre-1913 science fiction films are in like the 5 to 10 minute range. So you could pretty much watch all of science fiction film up to that point. I think in like less than 2 hours that survives.
That's a lot shorter than our podcast.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But I think one difficult thing about talking about early film is that so much of it just does not survive. And even the well-acclaimed films like Metropolis and things like that, there have been issues with parts of the reels being missing and several minutes of footage not surviving. So some challenges there, but I think for the very early days of science fiction film from, I don't know, 1897 or 1912 or so, George Méliès is definitely the master of that era. I think all of his work is pretty great, but A Trip to the Moon, The Eclipse, and The Astronomer's Dream are my personal favorites. He had a lot of imitators, and I think really the only one that is on par with him is the Italian film Interplanetary Matrimony, which is just a really delightful and adorable little film.
So I can't really comment on any of that, but Gretchen, have you seen any of the Méliès films?
I've only seen Trip to the Moon, of course, that being one of the most famous ones.
Yeah.
I haven't seen much of the others.
That sounds like the best one.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool film, but I have not seen any of the other films from him. Even when it comes to silent films in general, I kind of have a gap with, like, a lot of the sci-fi films. I have seen, like, Metropolis, but besides those, I still haven't seen too much.
Yeah, well, a lot of people nowadays won't watch silent films, so I can't blame me for that, yeah.
Yeah, I think Metropolis is definitely the best out of the post-1913 era silent film, when film becomes more like feature length and not just like these cute little 5-minute animations that A Trip to the Moon and a lot of the Méliès films are. And I don't know, the early stuff is really, really fun. The animation techniques are really cool, especially for the era. But when the films start to get more in line with what we now think of as a movie, 90 minutes to 120 minutes or so, Metropolis is, I think, anyway, in a real class of its own. I've seen a fair amount of other silents from that period. Alita, Queen of Mars, Fritz Lang's other one, Women on the Moon, a couple other German ones like Algo, A Tragedy of Power, and there was this one disaster movie I saw.
Seems like those were always popular.
Oh, yeah, no, disaster movies, there's tons of those, yeah. And there's this other one I saw, Himmelskibbet, which is which they fly to like Mars in a biplane or something like that. And yeah, a lot of that stuff is kind of cool. It's certainly historically interesting and definitely interesting to watch it on a technical filmmaking level. But Metropolis as like a film is just leaps and bounds above everything else.
Yeah, because it actually has a story, so...
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
It's based off a novel, which I would like to cover on the podcast at some point.
I'd be interested in that.
Yeah, I definitely think that's what we should do, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think for early horror, there's a lot more to say about other directors that really shot at a master level of filmmaking. But for early science fiction, I think Méliès and Fritz Lang are really the two filmmakers to look at from that era. The two books that I could recommend on both of them are The Fantastic Voyages of the Cinematic Imagination, George Méliès's A Trip to the Moon, and Patrick Milligan's Fritz Lang, The Nature of the Beast. But in the late 1920s, a lot of new changes happened within the science fiction genre. Namely, Amazing Stories is launched and publishes the story Philip Francis Nolan's Armageddon 2419 AD, which we've debated covering on the podcast, but I don't know, it's apparently not very good. JM, I think you said you read it before?
Yeah, I mean, a long time ago, I read most of it. I kind of skipped over a few pieces here and there. But yeah, it's really not good. We talked about racial stuff on the podcast before, and we usually have to point it out, but we still try to find the good side of the work. I think with something like this, it's a lot harder because it doesn't really have a lot of value in itself. Like, I guess it could be considered a fun, exciting story from a certain perspective, but there's a lot better examples of that kind of pulpy writing that don't really have to involve extreme racism against Asian people.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. Yeah. It's just kind of funny to think about that Buck Rogers came from that, because he's just such a, well-known character, although I guess after the 1980s he kind of fell out of favor.
Yeah.
I don't think there's been any kind of Buck Rogers revival since Buck Rogers in the 25th Century TV show.
No, I don't believe so.
But that was a lot of people really love and still have fond memories of that show. So
yeah, and I mean, Buck Rogers represents kind of all the big changes that do happen in science fiction media during this time. So we get the story's first appearance in Amazing, then we get an adaptation as a comic book as well as film and radio serials. And I never really got into comics, but a lot of the industry really does get going around this time, as some of the fanzine editors we talked about in our fanzine episode kind of lament about. But a lot of the 30s science fiction film serials like Flash Gordon and the Buck Rogers ones are also mirrored in radio serials. I've seen the Flash Gordon film serials, which is pretty cool, but I've never listened to any of the accompanying radio serials.
No, I've never heard any either. I did try to watch one of those, the Flash Gordon serial. Or was it even that one, or was it another one of like radioactive something? I can't remember for sure. I think it was Flash Gordon though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And then of course I've seen the 1980 film.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah.
And I guess TV kind of starts to come into the picture in the late 30s. The BBC broadcast an adaptation of RUR in 1938. But I'd say science fiction serialized TV really doesn't get going until the late 1940s in the form of Captain Video and his Video Rangers from 1949, which is the start of a number of American juvenile TV series like Space Patrol. There's another Flash Gordon series, Commando Cody, Sky Marshal of the Universe. And I don't know, none of that juvenile stuff really had much interest for me.
Yeah, I can't remember who it was. Not Jack Williamson. I can't remember now. I'll have to look it up. Maybe we'll put it up in writing somewhere. But one of the writers, pretty famous science fiction writers of the time, did write stuff for Captain Video on a sort of uncredited, I guess, kind of like one of those things as check job, which we'll be getting into more of later, I'm sure. But yeah, so he wrote a lot of stuff for Captain Video, apparently. And it seems like the studios and so on, they always thought, oh, this far out space stuff will really get the kids in, right? And even though they maybe cared a little less about it than some of the actual writers in the magazine might have at the time, they were able to pay better. So,
right,
and that continued on till the present day, basically. So, and people getting their commissions to write books and comic strips, for example, just for a property that belongs to somebody else, and just kind of do their thing. And then that's what we're going to be talking about a little later. So it's interesting how it all ties together.
Yeah, certainly looking at the writing credits for a lot of these early TV shows and radio shows, a lot of very familiar names from the science fiction pulp market also appear in the radio and TV arena. So a fair amount of crossover. And I think both the radio and TV industries start to incorporate more content oriented towards, I guess, more adults and less juvenile audiences sometime in the mid to late 1950s. So the BBC started doing the Quatermass serials. The first one is from 1953 and mostly lost, but the second and third one, Quatermass 2 and Quatermass in the Pit, still survive, which are just pretty fascinating historical snapshots, even though I think I prefer the movie versions of both of those. But
yeah, so a lot of these old TV shows were done live, so there wasn't really, like, it's not even that they didn't have money for effects, it's like there was no such thing as post-production, so you pretty much, what you see is exactly what was happening behind the camera and in front of the camera.
Yeah, isn't there, I believe I remember seeing that during one part of the first Quatermass serial, like there's a fly on the lens or something during, like, 10 minutes of it or so.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. I don't know if I've seen the surviving episodes of the first Quatermass serial, but a lot of the Dark Shadows episodes were pretty much shot live. Like they would only ever do a second take in extreme circumstances. And yeah, flies make their appearance a lot on actors and lenses and various other places when they're shooting some of those.
Yeah, I haven't seen any of the TV serials for Quatermass, just the films so far.
The films are great.
Oh yeah,
I really like those
cool.
a lot.
I like the serials too, and there are a couple of cases where the actual I think is good. Like it adds a little more to the story and stuff, but it's just the films actually have a bit of budget behind them. I mean, obviously it's modest by modern film standards, but yeah, they have a bit more excitement, I guess, that they're able to pull off, maybe. So yeah,
no, they're definitely a lot of fun. And some of the radio shows that move away from juvenile-oriented stuff during the 1950s include Beyond Tomorrow, 2000 Plus, the aforementioned Journey into Space, Dimension X, X-1, and Exploring Tomorrow. I'm really largely unfamiliar with a lot of these. I think I've only listened to a couple episodes of X-1.
Right. So Dimension X and X-1 were two American shows, and
Yeah.
they actually, not so much, well, yeah, a bit Dimension X. X-1 is kind of the follow-up to Dimension X. I don't know if they were both done by Columbia, but they used stories from Galaxy and Astounding. That was pretty much their basis. So that you get to hear really good dramatizations of stories by Theodore Sturgeon, Ray Bradbury, Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, Frederick Pohl, you name it. It's pretty cool. It's actually how I got introduced to quite a few stories. I mean, I was already reading a lot of the stuff from that time, mostly because of Asimov, because that's how I started learning about the magazines and Campbell and all those guys. And so it just kind of grew out from there. But yeah, I mean, even in the early 90s, there was a local radio station broadcasting X-1. So you could listen to old-time radio at 11 p.m. on a Sunday night and stay up when I was like 11 or so, listening to not just X-1, but like a lot of, they did like to do stuff like Gangbusters and Dragnet and stuff like that.
Yeah,
all these old radio shows. Yeah, it's pretty good stuff. Pretty exciting. It's interesting hearing the production values on display at that time. Like, a lot of it sounds pretty good, but like nowadays there's so much opportunity for really awesome sound design that you didn't have back then either, right?
Yeah, I mean, tape equipment had just come into the picture at that time, so people were just kind of getting the hang of how to do that production effect. Whereas now everything is on a computer, and it's just so much easier to do from a practical standpoint. But yeah, tons of huge names.
The thing about the American shows, too, is that they were all very, very set to the format. So, like, you couldn't break away from that 25-minute episodic format. And that's kind of one thing I noticed about the British shows, is that they were more, like, flexible.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be... We can do, like, a 12-part miniseries of one continuous storyline. Why not, right?
But I think when people think of 50s science fiction visual media, it's really the classic 50s science fiction film that most people think of, as this is definitely the golden era of silly B movies and all that stuff. And
some of them are great. Really great.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a few legitimately great ones that are, I think, very well critically acclaimed outside of genre. And niche circles like Forbidden Planet and The Day the Earth Stood Still. But I don't know, some of the monster films, especially the British stuff like Crawling Eye and X the Unknown and the Quatermass stuff, is just really awesome.
Yeah, I love The Crawling Eye.
Yeah.
It's such a cool movie.
That's a cool film.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've all seen this really awesome film, so you guys should watch it too. If you like Quatermass and Doctor Who and monster movies, and you love this. And it's cool how it throws in so many different things too. Like it's always adding complications, as Van Vogt would say. So yeah,
no, definitely a lot of fun. As far as television stuff outside of the U.S. and the U.K., it looks like there's some stuff that starts to get produced in Europe and Japan, starting from the late 1950s and into the 1960s. But I really haven't seen any of that stuff, though there is an interesting German show called Space Patrol Orion, which premiered on September 17th of 1966, just 9 days after the airing of Star Trek's The Man Trap. And the show revolves around a starship with an international crew and a womanizing captain, which is a pretty amusing set of coincidences between the two shows, though there are some very obvious differences between the two. The Space Patrol Orion is much more military-focused in the starship's purpose. The series basically is trying to thwart an alien invasion in the solar system, and it's much less focused on the exploration angle. But yeah, it's kind of cool how both the Germans and the Americans arrived at a very similar place in the exact same time. It's definitely an interesting one to check out. I think it's only like 7 or 8 episodes. It's been a very long time since I've watched it, but yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, I've heard of it, but I've never been able to check it out.
Yeah.
So.
But it's Star Trek that we're here to talk about tonight, and Doctor Who, which are by far the biggest franchises to come out of science fiction television, possibly ever. And they've had a profound effect on science fiction fandom and are obviously still major pop culture phenomenon in this present day. And that's kind of my very roundabout way of tying this all together with the last few episodes. So I guess with that stuff out of the way, let's start to take a look at Star Trek and its impact on science fiction.
I think we all know that Star Trek debuted in 1966, created by Gene Roddenberry and his wonderful team of televisual experts. And yeah, it's a show that has had a pretty gigantic and unbelievable impact. I'm sure Roddenberry hoped it would, but I don't think that a lot of the people kind of in the television networks and so forth anticipated just how much of an impact it would have.
Yeah, when we were talking about the Star Trek fan fiction stuff in our fanzines episode a couple episodes back, I had mentioned an interview that was posted on YouTube with two of the women that were involved with setting up the first Star Trek convention. And they said that the attendance of that first convention dwarfed some of the all-purpose general science fiction convention as far as attendance and people showing up goes, which is just absolutely incredible. Their circulation was in huge numbers, so there was a much greater impact as far as mainstream culture goes than basically anything else in science fiction, I think, that had come up to that point.
Mm-hmm. And the general science fiction community in the United States was very interested in Star Trek. One of the reasons they were interested was that they knew that it was the way that a lot of people would get into science fiction, because they would see this on television. And I've been reading in preparation for this because we are going to talk about novels. So I've been reading this book it's basically an account of Star Trek novels and their history. It actually has brief comments about every single book from the author, although some of the authors did not comment for the book. But the ones that did, they all have something to say about their experience writing for Star Trek, and a lot of them talk about how they first watched the show in the 60s, or when it was on syndication in the 70s, which is actually when it really started to get popular, which is kind of interesting. Most people seem to think when the show got canceled, at least the non-fans considered the show to be a flop. They didn't really think that it had been successful, and I guess the viewing figures were not to their satisfaction, considering the money they were spending on it. So fans did notice, and the science fiction community did notice, and even going back to Mr. Campbell there at Astounding, he was pretty keen on Star Trek, even though Gene Roddenberry seems like those two guys might not get along so well. And I'm going to get into that because I want to talk about Star Trek as a general concept and how we feel about it. And there's some interesting stuff that comes up when you talk about Star Trek, because it is a very optimistic vision of the future, but it's not just a scientifically optimistic view. It's like, hey, we don't need capitalism anymore, and we have a kind of military, but we're not aggressive.
It's a post-scarcity society where...
Right. It's a post-scarcity society there that a lot of the time science fiction writes cautionary tales about, what'll happen in the future if all our needs are met. We have robots do everything for us and stuff like that, and humans will become fragile and we won't be able to do anything, and if something goes wrong, the whole society is going to break down and stuff like that. And Roddenberry just seems to be saying, no, that everybody's needs are accounted for, and people are really into exploring and learning about other cultures and going out into the universe. And it's optimistic in a way that's not necessarily, it does kind of turn into that anyway, but it seems like not very centered on things like conquest or colonialism or even human-centric worldviews. So, how did you guys get into Star Trek?
So I first caught Star Trek through the Next Generation syndicated episodes in the early 90s sometime. It was definitely before Deep Space Nine aired, and I got really into that. Was that as pretty much syndicated from the last 30 years onwards. Next Generation has really, really thrived in syndication, I think, possibly more so than any of the other series. But yeah, I really like Next Generation, and then I got into Deep Space Nine as it aired and kind of fell off of it for a while, but then got really back into it around the time when season 4 started up. Never really got into Voyager or Enterprise. The original series I like a fair amount, and certainly a lot of the movies there are a lot of fun. As far as the new shows go, I don't know. I wasn't really into Discovery that much at all. I watched the first 4 episodes of Strange New Worlds, and I thought that was a really good reboot of the formula, though I didn't really like the whole excessive prequel thing. Like, we need to tie like every minor detail of a previous mention in a show to like a whole new thing.
That's kind of the danger of franchise fiction. And
yeah.
I have a lot to say about this now, especially after reading about like some of these writers' experiences trying to write for Star Trek and Doctor Who. I mean, we'll get to it when we start talking about tie-ins in general in a few minutes, but yeah, so, and that happens on TV too, and I think like several generations have gone by, and now the people that are writing it, they've been watching it for like 2 generations, and they're kind of really immersed in this world, and they want to tie everything together but make something new at the same time. And it's like, I personally haven't gotten into any of the recast TOS characters. Like, I don't know, I guess just, for some reason, it's a thing about a lot of television and movies and stuff, is that it's not just a character on a page, it's a character portrayed by a specific person. And like, I mean, yeah, you know, people always point out to me things like, well, you know, you don't complain about that when you go see the 6 millionth version of Hamlet or something like that. Oh, somebody else is playing, or like, but I don't know. I think that there's a difference between classic theater and television, and I don't know. It kind of bothers me personally that they just don't create their own characters. Like, I don't understand why they don't do that.
Yeah. I haven't seen any of the new series yet. I should say I got into Star Trek shortly around the same time I got into Doctor Who. I got into Doctor Who around 2012. It was right before the 50th anniversary, which was great because then when the 50th anniversary happened, everyone was talking about it. So it was really nice to have that happen. I got into Doctor Who then, and then about a few months after I started getting into Doctor Who, I decided to watch Star Trek, and I started with the original series and have since then, I've seen up until Enterprise. I haven't seen all of Voyager still because it was taken down on the site I was watching it on, and then I still have yet to finish it. And I was going to say about the new series is I also am not that big a fan of when they try to expand on the whole, like, it's prequel fatigue, stuff like that, totally. Nostalgia bait. I feel like Enterprise does do a better job at that just because they do have an original crew, even while they do explore certain concepts from TOS and from things that would be in the future.
Yeah. So for me, I remember some TOS episodes when I was a kid, like really small. My dad would sometimes go over to his friends' places and take me with him. And, you know, my dad was never a really big TV watcher, not really a big science fiction fan. He pretty much supported my interest in Doctor Who, which definitely came first. We'll get into that. But so we would go over there, and sometimes they'd watch Star Trek and stuff like that. And I remember when Next Generation started, I had 2 older cousins who were really into Star Wars, and they liked Star Trek, but I only really heard them start talking about it when TNG started. And especially the one older cousin, he was really, really excited about it, and he loved the new ship, and because he was really into military stuff and airplanes. Like, he was the kind of the guy who had like model airplanes all over, like strung up from the ceiling and on his walls and stuff like that. So he was like really excited by the ship design, and I remember specifically him telling me about how the saucer section could separate from the drive and do its own thing, and he thought that was just the coolest thing in the world. And So this new Star Trek show, and I guess in the end, I didn't 100% register, but one day we were watching TV, and it was an episode of season 1 of TNG. It was called The Battle. It's an episode where Captain Picard he meets up with this Ferengi and gets this weird, mysterious orb, and it links him to something that happened in the past on his old ship when he supposedly destroyed this Ferengi vessel or something like that.
Right,
and
right.
This is during the time when the Ferengi were quite different than what they would eventually be.
Yeah, they tried to make them the series villains, but it didn't really work out.
Yeah. The evolution of the Ferengi in Star Trek is pretty interesting, from that to comic relief for a long time to finally getting a more nuanced perspective in DS9.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this Ferengi in the episode was like comically evil and like, wow, like just I've enslaved Captain Picard's mind, and it was pretty fun though. But I was very confused because I knew it was Star Trek, but I thought Star Trek was supposed to have Captain Kirk and Spock and stuff. So I was like, where are those guys? Those don't sound like that's not them. So I was very confused, and in the years after that, I didn't really become a fan, I guess, till, again, like the early 90s. I think probably a little bit before Nate did. I would say I remember the 25th anniversary, and I think that was actually kind of how I started really getting interested, because I remember there was a program on television as, a celebration of Star Trek, and it had all these clips from the original series and from TNG, which had been going for a few years then, but it was mostly about the original series. But I remember that kind of got me interested in watching more Star Trek, and I guess just before that, we had borrowed a VCR, because we didn't have one in the house, and my mom rented Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock, which has forever screwed me up in my head, because when people talk about how emotional the end of Wrath of Khan is, I'm like, but don't you, it came back in the next film, and that was the one I saw first, so it was like, by the time I saw Wrath of Khan, it was like, stop trying to manipulate me. I know he's coming back. It was really funny. To this day, I'm still like, yeah.
Yeah. I do remember watching Wrath of Khan for the first time and thinking, well, now on to Search for Spock. I wonder what's going to happen in this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, they did it to themselves, because when the movie came out and it was called The Search for Spock, it's like you knew they were saying, all right, we brought Spock back. But at the same time, they also made it so that any fans who came to the show and the movie's late would never be surprised, because they'd always know that Spock came back after the emotional, devastating end of that damn second movie. So yeah, I watched a bunch of the movies. I had Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home on VHS, and
my favorite of the Star Trek films.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that one was really popular. So I got really into TNG 2, and DS9 started. I just loved it. I thought it was pretty much the greatest thing. But then Voyager happened, and when Voyager happened, at first I was all into it, but the more I watched it, the less I liked it. And I don't know if it was just that, and it was just me getting interested in other things. I don't know. I completely lost the affinity for Star Trek around 1996, maybe, or something. And I would say I didn't come back to it till around 2013. So I just pretty much stopped completely. I never watched Enterprise. Now, I've watched a few episodes of the first season of Enterprise, and I've been really enjoying it. I like it a lot. I kind of wish I had watched it then, because maybe it would have made me like Star Trek again sooner. But I would say the height of my interest in Star Trek was around, 1992 to 1995, roughly. That's pretty much reading books, watching all the stories. I watched all of TOS. My first watching of TOS, I thought it wasn't as good as The Next Generation, and I often was kind of ridiculing it a little bit. But as time has gone on, I started to actually like it more than The Next Generation, which is kind of funny, but it's the way it goes sometimes.
They both had different atmospheres, though. I think at the start, TNG doesn't really know what it's trying to do, and a lot of it feels like kind of like inferior retreads of TOS, but the, I guess, acting and the whole production values and things like that. It's definitely different with TOS. I mean, Shatner is a classic great overactor, and he just brings a completely different mood to the show than somebody who's like a trained Shakespearean actor like Patrick Stewart is.
Yeah. Although, to be fair, Shatner also did Shakespeare, but not for the Royal Shakespeare Company, that's for sure.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think I was talking about this with my friend. We did a couple of Star Trek streams on his YouTube channel, John Gill, and we were talking about this, and I think The Next Generation is just really comfortable to watch. Like, it just has this thing about it where you never really, sometimes you don't feel that much from it, but you never really feel that upset by it that you want to turn it off. You know, it's just like, it's really comforting to experience, and it's like, not turn your brain off necessarily, but it just feels like, oh, the ship is so comfortable, and it's got that constant background noise of the ship and all the fun characters. I mean, I've said this before, maybe even on this podcast, but I actually like the early days of Next Generation. I have a lot of fondness for that. I think it's the end of the show where things kind of, I don't know, it just starts to feel too rote and like kind of boring. Like, just not really, I don't know, they keep trying to introduce all these things that feel like they should be important, but they can't really do anything with them because it's the end of the show, and it's just, I don't know, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm like, I often say, I like the beginning stuff, so I like the fact that they haven't figured out all the characters yet. I think it's fun. It's fun that Worf just makes stupid comments all the time, like, for no reason other than he's Klingon. And it's fun that Jordi LaForge just acts really out of character sometimes because they haven't figured out his character yet.
Yeah.
I don't know. I enjoy that. I like the fact that there are many different music composers too, so it has like a different sound to it where like they kind of settled on one composer for the last few seasons, so the episodes all kind of have the same style of music to them and everything, and it's uniformity. But anyway, yeah. So I like Star Trek 2. We're all fans. The concept of Star Trek, like I was saying, is interesting because it is so positive. And I don't know how I feel about the post-scarcity thing. You know, I mean, I want to really embrace it. A part of me can't help but feel like it's too nice, I guess, sometimes.
And they try to tone it back a bit in DS9, I think, when they introduce like Latinum as a currency and other supply issues with, I don't know, the whole occupation and various other things related to the...
Yeah, I mean, like, Deep Space Nine in general kind of acts as just a deconstruction of the things that happened before. So I feel like Deep Space Nine retains the optimism of the previous series, but also challenges it at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's why I feel it's a much more rewarding show overall than Next Generation, even though there's like some really brutally bad stuff in Deep Space Nine that you just never get in Next Generation. But at the same time, it's easy to just skip those episodes of Deep Space Nine and, you know, no problem.
But as for the concept, though, again, I think the new series also definitely take the Federation down a peg. But I also I'm not sure. You know, this is why I'm so conflicted, because, yeah, I was going to say, I mean, yes, a part of me thinks it's too nice, and I want to be like, the Federation can't possibly be like that. Like, you know, nobody needs any money. Everybody, even though they have replicators that can make any food stuff for them they want, they still like doing things like cooking just because it's fun, and they'll do it anyway. So where does all the stuff they cook come from? Like, there's one episode that I watched recently where O'Brien is hanging out with his wife, and they're eating some food that he made with the replicators, and he's apologizing to her because he made this, like, thick Irish stew, and he wasn't able to use real beef or something like that because it's the replicator. And, like, of course she's disgusted by this food, but she's trying to be polite and eating it and stuff. And meanwhile, he's reminiscing about how he grew up and how his mom made all this food and stuff. And I'm like, well, where'd she get all that? It didn't come from the replicator, so there must be people growing all this stuff and, like, slaughtering animals just because people like to cook. Like, there's all these things that I wonder about, and the fact that everybody seems to love 20th century art. Yeah, why is that? Yeah. Like, you know, and older stuff. There doesn't seem to be a lot of, like, the cynical side of me wonders, oh, you know, do they make art in the 24th century then? And like, what is it?
There is this one comment, I don't remember what episode it's in. It's like a kind of just momentary conversation between Bashir and Garrick during one of their lunches, where I think Bashir is talking about like how a lot of human art at that time is like it's like adaptations of other cultures' art. Like they haven't made anything really original in a while. Nothing of note that's like their own original works.
That's really interesting. I've watched most of that show, but I still need to do a complete rewatch sometime because it's been a long time. I just watch random episodes here and there, and I sometimes miss out on some of the good ones. But see, again, like that's, the piercing of the Star Trek bubble, which is important. But I am conflicted because a part of me is like, that's really nice. I mean, maybe not so much the lack of original art, but like the fact that so much time and effort is put into exploration. People don't seem to need things that they can't have, at least on Earth, at this time. In the Federation inner circle, I guess. They don't require for anything. And I guess they just, they work because they like it. And a lot of them do cool things like join Starfleet and hang out on starships. So it feels good, It feels like a part of me is like, I don't mind seeing the bubble burst, but I don't know if I want to see it burst that far, because I do kind of appreciate that vision of the future. It feels, again, it is kind of comforting. You can see why some creators in the 60s were like, that really seems like the world's going to go through hell, because it's starting to go through hell right now. It's going to go through hell, but eventually we're going to come out of it, and we're going to be better, and then we're going to contact aliens, and the aliens are going to show us all this cool technology, and we're going to all exchange ideas and help each other, and it's going to be space utopia. And that's kind of what our book today is about. It's an original series novel, and Gretchen, you've chosen it, and it was the Star Trekiest of the Star Trek.
Yes.
Very nice way to describe it. Yeah, so why don't we get into that? So, Gretchen, why don't you tell us about Diane Duane and The Wounded Sky?
Born May 18th, 1952, in New York, Diane Duane was a fan of Star Trek since it first premiered. She was one of the writers that saw it right when it came out. Although she had written fantasy stories for herself since she was a kid, and she has mentioned writing her first book at the age of 8 in crayon, she did not seem interested in pursuing being a professional writer. During her attendance at Roosevelt Senior High School, which she graduated from in 1970, she received a Regents Science and Nursing Scholarship. From 1970 to 1971, she studied astronomy and astrophysics at Dowling College in Oakdale, New York. After admitted difficulties with calculus and other high mathematics, which I completely understand, she transferred to Pilgrim State Hospital School of Nursing in Long Island and graduated in 1974 with a specialty in psychiatry. For 2 years after receiving her degree, she worked at the Payne Whitney Clinic of New York Hospital, a highly respected psychiatric clinic in the U.S. While working at this clinic, she received encouragement from friends who had read her work to pursue writing as a career. After a year of working as an assistant for writer David Gerald, she started this pursuit, and her first book, The Door into Fire, was published by Dell Books soon after in 1979. This book got her nominated for the John W. Campbell Best New Writer Award 2 years in a row. She has since written 2 other books in the same universe as this novel. Besides these, she has written various other novels, notably those forming the Young Wizard series, which seems to be her most popular collection of original works.
Yeah, it's quite a lot of those, I noticed.
Yeah.
That
I believe it's about 11 books, I think, is how many are in that series. And, I think she's done, a couple of spin-off series as well.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, so she's got quite a few.
And that's pretty cool. I mean, it does seem like a lot of these authors, as I've been reading through, it is pretty much a who's who of contemporary American science fiction literature authors, even. Like, not everybody, but for sure a lot of familiar names pop up.
Yeah.
Star Trek was always good with that, too. The TV show had stuff from Theodore Sturgeon, Robert Bloch.
Sort of from Harlan Ellison, even though it was
Harlan Ellison, of course.
very altered since then.
Right, which is cool because it's like the next generation. By the time they got to TNG, it was like they were all TV authors, so they didn't really use... I mean, and it's not to say they were being snobbish, it's just that, as is often pointed out in the book about the novels, writing prose and writing for television is very different.
Yeah.
So, yeah, like, it's not necessarily, I mean, the writers for television kind of stick to their thing, and the writers for prose often stick to their thing. But Roddenberry seemed to want to solicit the real science fiction writers, so he was able to an extent. Apparently, there were a lot more writers who were solicited who failed to contribute Star Trek scripts that they used, like a Van Vogt, for example. So...
Yeah. Just a note also is that they did have a couple of unsolicited scripts by fans, specifically the empath in TOS, which is Joyce Musket, which is one of my favorite episodes of the series, actually. And that one was... Yeah. I don't believe she has any other television credits or even other writing credits except that episode.
Oh. Interesting. Yeah.
But yes, Diane Duane, of course, is also known for her work for multiple franchises. She has a number of television writing credits under her belt, with her initial credits mostly for animated series working on scripts for Hanna-Barbera back in the early 1980s. And things like Scooby-Doo, and also apparently Laverne and Shirley had an animated series, which I did not know about until looking through her Wikipedia page. However, she eventually expanded to work on live-action series as well. Alongside these works, she also wrote for franchises through the publishing of tie-in novels, most notably, obviously, for Star Trek. Though she does claim to have written Star Trek fan fiction before this point, which she is thankful hasn't survived or is very popular, her decision to write an official novel came a few years after the publishing of her first book. The desire came about, she says, through her annoyance after reading another book for the franchise. She believed that she could write something better than that, so she called her agent and told him she'd resolved to create a Star Trek novel. This first novel, published in 1983, is the one we're covering tonight, The Wounded Sky. But she also has written several others, including The Romulan Way, co-written by her husband and fellow sci-fi and fantasy author Peter Morwood, and one of a handful of her books about the Romulans, her ideas about whom many fans regard as canonical. I believe you said you'd read this one, JM?
Yeah, so I've actually read quite a few of her books, I realize. I kind of knew the name was familiar, and getting back to, I guess, Star Trek novels in general, I do want to talk about the history of that just a little bit, because it is kind of interesting, and it does tie in with a lot of our authors, too. But yes, from Duane, I've also read... Yeah, Doctor's Orders.
Yes.
The Romulan Way. And something else. I wrote it down somewhere. There was another name that I recognized from my big phase of Star Trek reading.
One of her other really popular ones is Spock's World.
Oh, yes, that was it. Yeah. I've read that as well. So that's actually the book that comes right after this one. I mean, not in the series, but by her. That this was her next Star Trek book, and I think that book probably contributed more to the Vulcans and the Vulcan culture than anything else that I can think of. I don't know if the show ended up using all that in the future, but definitely, all their history and a lot of this stuff that's not really mentioned on TOS, for the most part that I know of, comes up in this book, and I feel like it's pretty widely acknowledged as canon, to use that dreaded word that I hope not to use too much during this episode. Star Trek novels in general, though, pretty much the first things that you see are novelizations, and this is the case with Doctor Who as well. Our first Star Trek novelizations are actually several logbook series written by James Blish, a writer who we came across before in our fandom episode. And essentially, Blish's job was to novelize every single episode of the original series. And pretty much he did that, although he ended up having a lot of health concerns by the mid-70s. So he started doing this in 1967 when the show was still being made. And he didn't have any experience with the show itself when he started the novelizations. He was working from scripts and notes only. So it's an interesting thing to fans to spot all the things that he did differently from the episodes, because, I don't know, I've only read one of these logbooks in my younger years, so and I can't say I remember. I mean, it had some classic episodes in it, but I don't even know if I had watched them all at the time, so I don't know that the differences were that apparent to me, and there's like 12 of these things. The last 2 or 3 were completed mostly by his wife, Judith, because he was too ill to finish them. And a lot of people read these. When the animated series started in the 70s, Alan Dean Foster started doing novelizations of that as well. And he's pretty much the TV tie-in and movie tie-in novel guy, is Alan Dean Foster. He's all over the place. So much so that books get attributed to him that he didn't actually write. Like the novelization to Star Trek The Motion Picture, which some people think he ghost wrote for Roddenberry, but apparently Gene actually did write the whole thing. So, but the first original Star Trek novel, though, was Mission to Horatius. Mac Reynolds was the writer of Voyage to Horatius, and he was also a published science fiction author for many decades by that point. Probably a friend of Frederick Pohl's, and his stories are interesting. They definitely have a bit of a left-wing slant to them, so he seems like the right kind of guy to write for Star Trek. But Mission to Horatius was meant as a sort of a young adult novel, and it was published in 1968, and now, if you get it, it's a reprint made by Pocket, most likely, because it went out of print as the publisher went bankrupt. So, original copies probably now run a couple of $100 if you wanted to get one, but
I do have a reprint of it myself. I have seen an original copy of it in Ticonderoga, the recreation of the TOS set, and they have that in one of their museum parts of it with all of the displays.
That's pretty neat. Yeah, so Frederick Pohl was the editor at Bantam at that time, and he kind of acquired the Star Trek line. And he says, I acquired the line in 1972. James Blish told me that the biggest checks he had ever seen came from these Star Trek novels. A number of Star Trek fans wanted to do their own stories, and that's why we did the New Voyages, which was a series of anthologies that were published in the early 70s. And he says, the truth is, I never paid much attention to Star Trek. But obviously, he was right in on it, doing a lot of the editorial work in those early days. Blish also wrote an original novel called Spock Must Die that was published in 1970. But the Bantam line of Star Trek novels went away with the anthologies pretty much in the 70s. And it was then that the Star Trek license was sold to Pocket Books, which is a division of Simon & Schuster. And they started with The Entropy Effect in 1981 was the first original Star Trek novel out of that line. So it was 2 years before this one. And before that, they did, of course, one of the motion picture, which had already come out by then. So we're looking at the period of Star Trek when it wasn't on television. And this is an interesting period because I discovered in reading Voyages of Imagination, which is the Star Trek novel guide, I discovered, because I didn't really know a lot about the novels and what fans thought of the original novels, but I had noticed, and this is not to, I guess, put down one over the other or anything like that, but I had noticed that a lot of the Star Trek novels that I had read were very, very safe. They didn't really seem to want to rock the boat very much, and they really didn't want to suggest anything that might contradict something that was on television. And sometimes it seemed obvious that they were holding back. And I since discovered that this time, when I was reading Star Trek novels, it is actually considered a bit of a dark time in Star Trek fiction. And the reason for that is that in 1985, they started to concoct a plan that is Paramount and Gene Roddenberry to bring Star Trek back. And indeed they did with The Next Generation, which is a show we've already spoken of a bit. But this also meant that Gene and his assistants had a very firm hand on everything Star Trek at that time because it was a publicity thing, and it was really important. And then by the time Next Generation came on, it was like, well, now we're invested in this again. And I guess this brings me to something that I did want to talk about, and that is tie-in novels in general. So, I mean, how much of this stuff have you guys read? Like, basically, people writing other people's scripts into prose form, movies, TV shows, using other people's intellectual property. Like, is that something you guys do on a regular basis?
Before I get into that, I did just also want to mention that it was 1985, the year Killing Time by Della Van Heist came out, which is a novel that originally had implications of a romantic relationship between Spock and Kirk. And they had told Van Heist to take those sections out, and she didn't by the time they had published. And I think it was 250 copies out on the shelves, and they had to pull all of them before they made the corrections. And I do think that might have contributed to why they had been so strict on future novels after that whole incident.
Yeah, so during this period is exactly when Doctor Who was in the opposite position.
Yeah.
So I think that's worth remembering at this time. So basically, the more the production company of the property has an interest in that property, the less freedom you're going to have as a prose writer. And that makes perfect sense if you think about it. And that gets to the core of the reason why so many people think that novels of this nature are inherently trashy. Because there's, you can break away from this, obviously, and some writers do, and make really good books. But obviously, the less oversight they have to deal with, probably the better the book's going to be. I mean, I think that's just, even for an amateur writer, sometimes that can be the case. Because, in this case, we have intellectual property, Star Trek, that belongs to a whole group of people, some of whom might not really be fans. Right? So, I don't know. Roddenberry had his assistant, Richard Arnold, and they were... I guess Roddenberry was mostly looking at the stuff in the beginning, and it seems like more and more he handed control over to this Arnold guy, and he was probably considered like the bane of pocket books or something. Like, I'm sure he was... Remember when we were talking about those guys getting together in that office in New York? Not office, in that restaurant, in New York. These old science fiction writers who didn't so much write for John Campbell, and they would sit there and complain about him and make fun of him and stuff like that. I picture this being like that kind of situation with all these Star Trek writers going like, oh yeah, he rejected my manuscript because apparently I don't know how warp drive works or something like that. And here's a really interesting double think comment from Gene Roddenberry that I thought was really interesting. So people were really down on this Arnold guy, and they basically... There were so many complaints about how, meticulous he was, right down to, I mentioned warp drive earlier, and sure, that's funny, but, characters. You can't write a character like this. He would not do this. He does not strike me as that kind of person. So, therefore, that's not how you're supposed to write him. And so, I guess some of the writers were complaining that he was being very harsh and restrictive, and somehow this got back to Roddenberry. And Roddenberry is supposed to have said to Arnold, now this is Arnold's account, don't forget, but he's supposed to have said to him, "It's my sandbox. If you want to come in and play with my kids, you have to treat them with respect." And so he's talking about the writers, and, he's saying, yeah, don't be mean to my writers, right? But, at the same time, it's my sandbox. And I don't know if it's sad or poignant or what, but when people talk about the early days of TNG being not that great, a lot of the time they blame Roddenberry because they say he was too pushy with his personal agendas. We'll get to something about that in a little bit when we talk about an episode that's been sort of inspired by the book we're about to read. So, with all those comments out of the way, this is before that period. Now, after things loosened up a bit, and as you might predict the things that loosened it up were pretty much the end of DS9. And it was decided that there was a desire to write more in the series, basically. So they did books that took place after the last Deep Space Nine episode and pretty much continued on the series with a free reign to do whatever they wanted. And that had never happened before in Star Trek prose fiction. As well as that, they put out a new series called New Frontiers in, I believe, 1997 is when it started. And New Frontiers is basically a brand new ship, a new crew, completely new characters, no ties to any Star Trek show except, yeah, occasionally they'll bring in somebody like a minor character on TNG or whatever, but it's essentially a whole new thing. So basically by the time, I guess, Enterprise was on, it seemed like the fiction area of Star Trek had loosened up a bit and they were able to do a little bit more stuff. To do that, they kind of had to test the waters of, is this going to sell? If people don't see the familiar characters, are they still going to buy the books? And, well, they did. So it's very different than Doctor Who, because with the show we're about to talk about next, you could never do anything like this. I mean, yeah. Like, the whole point is that it's Doctor Who. If you take the Doctor away, yeah, you can set cool things in the universe of Doctor Who, I guess, but, like, it's something else. It can't really be Doctor Who. And because of a connection to Doctor Who, it's probably always going to be labeled, like, very nerdy fan stuff, even if it's really good. Examples would be, like, the Faction Paradox stuff that started coming out. You know, people really, really like that. And they think it should be recognized by the mainstream because it really doesn't have that much tie to Doctor Who, but it has just enough where people will be like, oh, that's a Doctor Who thing. So yeah, with Star Trek, you can kind of set all different things in this world. And I know Gretchen and I have had a lot of conversations about that, about how we kind of want to see that on television and like different kinds of shows and whatnot. But I think they've been experimenting with Star Trek quite a bit lately, and it hasn't been all successful, but there's no reason why it couldn't be.
Nate, did you want to talk about your experiences with Star Trek tie-in novels or tie-in novels?
I really haven't read too much, honestly. These are really the only, I think, tie-in novels I've read in their entirety. In the 90s, I did play a couple of the Star Wars video games, namely X-Wing and TIE Fighter, which I believe take elements from some of the Star Wars novels at the time, like the Admiral Zahn stuff. But I've never really read any of those books, but I know that was a big thing. And again, it kind of ties into weird times for the various big franchises, because at the time there were no Star Wars movies in the early 90s, and it was, you know, basically just the video games and the novels, and you know, that allowed something like a Wing Commander franchise.
I have one Star Wars period novel from that period as well.
Yeah. But I mean, the novels were big at that time. But yeah, at that time, Star Wars was not really a thing in the theaters, and Doctor Who was off the air, and you know, Star Trek was going strong. But yeah, kind of an interesting time for the big franchises. But yeah, haven't really done too much tie-in stuff. And I have to say, I really did like these two selections for tonight. I wouldn't be able to choose a clear favorite from either of the two. I think they both do very different things, but I certainly enjoyed them. And you know, this one in particular has a really cool concept that Next Generation episode is enjoyable in some ways, but deviates from that quite significantly. And I think Duane does a really cool job of evoking some atmosphere and strange imagery and, I don't know, bizarre mental stuff. In a way, it kind of reminded me of, you know, what if C.L. Moore were to write a Star Trek novel? It might look something like this. But yeah, I thought that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I liked the book a lot. It did kind of feel like sometimes, I guess occasionally I was a little bit like, oh, it's too, you know, hand-waving away all this weird magical stuff, and it feels very cozy, but every time I tried to be cynical about it, I was kind of like swayed over the other way again. So I don't know. It's like it ended up working for me. The ending maybe a little less than the rest of it, but I think that's common. I mean, that might be true of the other book too. So I don't know. It just seems like there was a lot of really loving descriptions of the ship and the people on it, and it just felt so I love Star Trek so much, and I'm going to tell you why. And she did a pretty good job convincing you of why. It didn't come across too, I guess, fan-wanky is the word that gets sometimes thrown around.
Yeah, I didn't get that sense at all, no.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, it's very appreciative of the universe and its characters, but like never to like an obnoxious extent.
And the character she introduces here, I think, is a really cool character that you wouldn't be able to see on the show due to the limitations of production, especially in the 1960s when the TV show was initially on the air. I mean, you could probably do something that wouldn't look that great with CGI now, but something like this character really, I think, works a lot better in a prose format sometimes than you'd be able to convincingly make it on TV.
Yeah, I think that character is great. And she also introduces, even though he's not a major part of it, another character that's from a culture that has pretty interesting ideas with like time. And I like the exploration of like what could possibly be different in other alien cultures. Yeah. She really has a great lock on that.
Yeah, and that's one really cool thing about Star Trek is, how would evolution progress if given these environments on other planets and other worlds? How would the species biology incorporate that to survive and turn into a sentient, technologically advanced civilization? And her exploration of that here, I think, is really well done.
Yeah, I think the novels definitely, I have noticed that too. Not that Duane, she might be particularly good at this because she did a special, that book, The Romulan Way, is actually one of several books all about the Romulans, where she really, really explores their culture and like pretty much everything about them, and really immerses you in Romulans, which is something that that TV show didn't really do. Like, not even on that one DS9 episode that is on their planet. But you finally kind of get to see a little bit of that around then. But certainly with TOS, they were kept mysterious, and that was cool. I mean, that's like, they're always this mysterious presence, and she did the same for the Vulcans, where she wrote Spock's World, and she's like really went into their history and everything. So this is something she likes to do. But in general, I do think that when the novels, especially when they had all these weird rules to follow, like they couldn't bring back their own supporting characters, they could only bring back supporting characters from the show. They had all these weird rules to follow. Even then, what they could always focus on is the aliens and how, like, okay, the Federation's supposed to be, it's supposed to have a lot more alien stuff in it than what you see on the show for the most part, right? And I think they've started to explore that a little now with like some of the new series, like that show. It's one of the new cartoon shows, Prodigy. Yeah, like it features very, very non-human characters, and because it's a cartoon, it's like, well, that's okay, right? Like they don't have to. And it makes sense that they would do that. And like, I don't know. I mean, even with like Star Trek the Animated Series, right? Which, I don't know, this book actually reminded me a little bit of that. Have either of you watched any of that?
I haven't, no.
I have watched, I think, a handful of episodes, like really
have you?
Early on, around the same time I watched TOS, but I don't remember them too well.
Yeah, it's weird. Like, I don't know, I can't really comment on the animation style. I think it might be quite simplistic, because I don't really think that it's considered, like, some of the best animation around, but...
Yeah, it looks like the cartoons of its era, for sure.
Yeah, I know that there's a recurring sort of joke about they always have these like extreme close-ups of the characters' faces because they didn't want to design any details behind them. I do know about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just think it's really interesting because it's like stories that are generally a bit smaller scale than the TOS ones because they're like half the length, but at the same time, it's like they go trippy a lot, and they make it weird, and it is kind of a weird series, and it's like, if you like Star Trek, it's worth watching, because it's like, it's kind of a different take on Star Trek, and there were times when the book did remind me of that a little bit, but I think the animated series maybe is, I don't know, like, it's perceived as being a more juvenile thing, but I don't think it's necessarily that much more so than TOS. Maybe the way it looks, I can't say, but like, I don't necessarily get that vibe. Like, it's just kind of shorter, and it is weirder sometimes because of that. Like, there's episodes where they miniaturize, and episodes where and of course they encounter all kinds of weird beings like that generally are pretty minimalistically shown on TOS, like just an alien face or something like that. And I think with the animation, maybe they thought they could go a little bit more trippy, and this book does that too. And it definitely has, like, the alien characters are really cool, and I like the way she does them. They have personalities, and especially that name Katuk, is it?
Yeah, I wasn't sure how to pronounce it. I don't know.
I was going to say Katilk, but I don't know. It could be anyway.
The alien glass spider thing.
Yes.
Yeah, she's really cool.
By the way, on the back cover, calls her a pretty alien scientist on some versions, apparently, which Diane Duane wrote to subvert, because everyone obviously would expect a sexy alien woman, and it's a spider.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, going back to what we were talking about earlier, I don't know what Diane Duane's socio-political position is, and I don't pretend to guess, because as well as writing this pretty, like, feely kind of book, she also wrote Tom Clancy tie-ins. So I'm not really... I don't want to guess it. Maybe she talks about her politics on her website somewhere, but I don't know. Doesn't matter. But a funny comment that I noticed in the book, and I'm trying to decide whether she was been, like, goofing off about it, and I remember I noticed it, and I commented on it in the server right away, because it's like, is she trying to kill Star Trek, like, with one big swoop? Because it's Captain Kirk is talking to Cthulhu, and he says something like, "Oh, you're not supposed to talk about death and taxes in public." And Cthulhu says something like, "Well, I don't have to worry about either of those things." So then she goes on to say, "Oh yeah, well, everybody in Starfleet is exempt from paying taxes, but everybody else has to, apparently."
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, no wonder everybody wants to join Starfleet. And that also reminds me of Robert Heinlein in Starship Troopers.
Yeah.
Because in that society, pretty much only people who have been in the military, like, they get all kinds of perks in society, and they're, like, respected, and like, you don't have to join the military, but if you don't, there will be not penalties, but social consequences.
You can't vote or something like that.
Yeah, like social consequence, basically, for not signing up. Right. And you don't get to vote in elections if you're not. And, sometimes I get the idea that, that's how the Federation works, because it seems like Starfleet is, like, really, really special. And it's just kind of food for thought. Like, it's we think of Star Trek as being, and how we were talking earlier about Roddenberry's vision and stuff. It seems like people think of that stuff as being very, I guess, I don't know, like, people who don't get it like to say it's communist. And I definitely don't think it's going for that. And I think that, like, she's kind of, I don't know, maybe taking a little bit of a dig at it in that part, but a good-natured one, because obviously we're talking about how much she loves Star Trek, and that's how she does. But it was just a really funny thing that made me laugh. It's like, is that confirmed then? All the Starfleet personnel, they don't have to pay taxes because they're out there in space exploring for the Federation. So, I don't know. It's just funny. It's funny because, again, like, the same thing with Doctor Who. I feel really weird about this intellectual property business. Like, I feel weird about the whole idea of people writing for other people's stuff and then being judged on that ground rather than for the quality of their actual work, And it's like, I'm thinking, okay, there are people of probably all kinds of different political persuasions who write for things like Doctor Who and Star Trek, and yet so many of the fans think it's one thing and one thing only, and that's the only thing it can represent ever. And so there are people who will spend their dying days saying that Star Trek is not this, or Doctor Who is that, but not this. And unfortunately, when you're writing a book along these lines, you have to adhere to whatever the vision of the day of that property is. So, I don't know. But she did a really good job. Like, I kind of think of this as I would think of the so-called wilderness years for Doctor Who, which, again, we're going to talk about shortly. And it seems like the fans are very comfortable with it now, and they want to explore the background because, it's not on television anymore. Even the animated series is wrapped up. So, this is the new Star Trek, pretty much.
And it's definitely the Star Trekiest of Star Trek. So,
Yeah.
I don't know. Why don't we take a look at what actually happens in the novel?
Yes. The Wounded Sky starts with the Enterprise crew receiving a new invention called the inversion drive, created by a species of transparent spiders known as the Homolki, who practice a science known as creative physics, which basically seems like magic to other species. A Homolki scientist involved in the drive's creation, Katilk, boards the Enterprise for its first use. She also explains the principle of the drive. It can allow a ship to access an alternate universe or universes known as de Sitter space, which is infinitely hot and infinitely massful. It possesses infinite vector and acceleration qualities stored holographically in every part of it. The overall effect of de Sitter space is as if you had a whole universe crammed full of black holes compressing themselves to the ultimate limits of compression and beyond. A ship can travel to another part of the universe in zero time through its inversion into this space, where the laws of time and space don't exist. However, right before the Enterprise can try out the new drive, they are attacked by a fleet of Klingon ships. During this battle sequence, a really gripping one, by the way, the warp drive is activated near a sun, which causes it to go nova and destroy the Klingon fleet, as the Enterprise then implements the inversion drive to escape the effects themselves.
Yeah, I always really like those clever maneuvers that the captains pull, aside from just, going in with phasers and photons firing.
Yeah.
They use a star or do a gravity run around a planet or whatever.
It was really crazy and fun, that whole part.
Yeah, I liked seeing, and that's another thing, is every character, even like the main characters, obviously it's the triumvirate, you get to see them have like moments to shine, so like Sulu gets to be really cool in this moment, and I like that a lot.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was still pretty much the triumvirate, but
yeah.
Then you got Scotty, who had quite a few cool moments, and then Uhura had a little bit of cool stuff, and Sulu and mostly Chekhov. So, yeah, I mean, it did feel comparable to the way the series was, in the sense that you could tell who the main characters were, but everybody got their moment, you're right. And that was pretty cool.
Yeah, because, of course, in the series, you sometimes get, moments that aren't, Kirk and Spock and McCoy. The others do things, but it's nice to see them all having a chance through the novel to do that in, one piece of media. I really like that a lot.
Yeah.
But while the drive is in use, even though time has ceased to exist, the crew undergo experiences that are not their own, vividly remembering places and things they have never actually witnessed or felt themselves. They emerge at a location that doesn't align with their original coordinates, and Kirk realizes it wasn't just him that had that experience during the jump, but most of the crew. Two of the only exceptions are Katilk and a crewman by the name of Dehenish. The latter is a part of a species known as the Sadrau, who don't experience time like most other species, lacking past and future tenses in their language. The former Kirk has a discussion with in his cabin after the jump, where she discusses more of her culture, the Homolki mating rituals and religion, and why building is so important for them. She gifts Kirk a structure weaved from her own material for webs. Soon, though, the Enterprise prepares to use the drive again to get to the correct coordinates this time. The crew, Katilk and Dehenish included this time, experience others' memories again, but not of strangers. Instead, they receive memories from fellow crew members. It unnerves the crew, but also works to bring them closer together. There is a meeting of the senior crew Kirk waits for. Before it happens, he encounters Scotty and Katilk bonding over the inversion drive and its physics, as well as Uhura, McCoy, and Spock on the observation deck. Spock is called away, though, and Kirk soon finds out why. entropy has stopped working in an area of space they're near in the lesser Magellanic, which they decide to head towards and investigate.
There's basically this section that I wanted to read because it seems to epitomize what's, I guess, really cool about, like, the concept of Star Trek and why she likes Star Trek so much. So this is from chapter 10 of the book. And it's a section where Kirk is outside the ship, actually. And he's pretty much just decided he wants to go and look at space, which is pretty cool. He says, "There it hung above him, a galaxy, the galaxy, not shut safely outside a clear steel window, not even nearby any longer, but more distant than the Magellanic, a bright, shored island hanging grand and silent in the airless wastes, displaying all of its starry majesty at once. Jim just drifted there, letting himself see. Sol was lost in the sweep of stars in the leftward arm, an utterly insignificant 24th magnitude spark that not even the great 10-meter Artemis Luna reflector could have made out at this range. The whole Federation, from the Orionis worlds to the Vela congeries, was a patch of sparkle that an upraised finger could cover. The Klingon and Romulan empires were lost entirely. Awe grew in him and again, and a muted joy, but also an increasingly powerful disquiet, so strong that inside the suit Jim simply shook for a moment. The world that all his life had been around him was suddenly outside him. He was outside it, way out in the coldest deeps where no star shone. Jim gazed in uneasy wonder at the little spiral-shaped home of life, with all its lights left burning in the dark. It finally sank in, as it hadn't even, after the first jump, what he'd done to himself and the people he commanded. He'd gone too far this time. He and 438 souls were truly where no man had gone before, alone as no one in history had ever been. It delighted him. It terrified him. His voice sounded loud in the helm, as meaning it, he whispered that old phrase he'd read first in anguish. "O Lord, thy sea is so great, and my vessel so small." And the shaking and the awe went away, and that brought him to the matter he had come out here to resolve. It wasn't his crew's feelings about the danger of this situation that concerned Jim. The great starship's crews were selected with the danger of their missions in mind. No one made it onto a starship who didn't have one very important trait, an insatiable hunger and love for strange new worlds and impossible occurrences, a hunger so powerful that even the fear of death could be set aside for its sake when necessary. Enterprise and her sister starships were crewed by raving xenophiles. That's cool, man. That's why we're here.
That is a good part.
Yeah, she's a good writer.
Yeah, she's really good at just capturing, like, those thoughts and those moments from the crew. The use of the drive the third time is more catastrophic, as the crew collectively experience a chaotic attack of the Enterprise, the wounds from which remain once the jump concludes. As Kirk is being treated for his own injury, he learns that another universe without entropy is leaking that non-entropy, or anentropia, into theirs through a breach caused by the inversion drive. The spread of this anentropia to the rest of the universe will eventually cause any existence as they know it to cease. To prevent this, Spock suggests breaching the anomaly at the heart of it and fixing the rift, possible through Katilk weaving an entropy shield around the crew through creative physics. Making the decision to go through with this course of action, Kirk has the crew prepare for another jump, and the inversion drive is in use once again. During this leap, as the crew head towards the anomaly, they are not experiencing memories, but instead granted things they want and hope for. Kirk gradually encounters all of the crew, and they make their way through a space that appears uphill. The closer they get, the more they begin to feel each other's thoughts and presences. After a struggle to reach the fringes of the anomaly, the crews start to be perceived as their true selves, which results in a passage I'd like to read out. It is pretty long, but I think it does a great job both capturing how effective Diane Duane is at characterizing TOS characters and presenting why people admire those characters so much. Also, I've got a soft spot for McCoy, and I love when the dynamic between him, Spock, and Kirk are explored.
Yeah.
So, the Doctor saw Jim's stunned look, spoke a word or two to a couple of the people who were keeping him company, and left them behind to see to Kirk. Jim literally had to squeeze his eyes shut as Bones approached. McCoy blazed not with light, but with an intense compassion that could be felt on the skin, even from a distance, like sun in a desert. Jim had always known Bones cared deeply about people, but he was unprepared for the full truth of the matter. This passionate allegiance to life, this fierce charity that wished health and joy to everything that lived. Jim felt all the death in him, all the entropy, screaming and cowering away. It knew its enemy. He tried to drag Jim away with it, but he stood his ground, wondering whether he would survive McCoy's touch, or be able to stand the burning life it promised if he did. "Jim, you all right?" the familiar voice said, as a hand took him by the arm, the finger surreptitiously on the inside of the arm to find the brachial artery for the pulse. "Never better," Jim said, and gasped, too shocked to say anything else for a moment, or open his eyes. Strangely, it was true. The casual touch of McCoy's hand had staggered him like a graze from a phaser set on kill, but now he was feeling almost more alive than he could bear, and moment by moment the aliveness became more bearable. He tried to hide his need to gulp for air, then gave it up and just gulped, hoping his friend would simply think he was winded from the long walk. Hidden natures are getting loose, Jim thought. What we conceal doesn't stay that way here. It may be this isn't going to be a good place to stay for very long. Or, well, good, but not safe. "Just let yourself breathe, it'll pass," McCoy said, sounding slightly abashed. "Sorry, I keep forgetting, and that keeps happening." Jim opened his eyes and found McCoy easier to look at, though no less bright with compassion. Bones let Jim go, then glanced down with wry amusement at the hand that had both steadied and unsteadied his captain. "I want people to be better," he said with some wonder, "and they get that way. Dangerous stuff." "That armor getting heavy?" Bones said, sounding a bit tentative now. Jim shook his head, thinking, what armor? What's he seeing? "No problem," he said. "Bones, have you been noticing people?" McCoy looked away, nodding. "More than people," he said. "If this crew wasn't comfortable with itself before, it will be now. But Jim, have you seen—" "Captain," the other familiar voice said on his other side. "Are you well?" And Jim turned to look at Spock and was dazzled again, but this time he couldn't look away. Spock hadn't changed, but his spirit showed as it never had before, even in the harrowing intimacy of mind meld. From the meld, Jim was already familiar with the incessant activity of that cool, curious mind as it tirelessly hunted answers. But now he saw where the activity came from. Spock's utter certainty that there was no higher purpose for his life than to burn it away in search of truth, and to give that truth away when he found it. More, Jim saw what fueled and underlay the certainty. A profound vulnerability paired with a great unreasonable joy, the deepest hidden parts of Spock's Earth-human heritage, both of them sheer terror to a Vulcan mind. Even when Spock had been trying to suppress or deny those hidden legacies, they had managed again and again to escape and express themselves as valor and wry humor and the endless good-natured fencing with McCoy. But Spock wasn't denying the inheritance so vehemently anymore, and the power of the older, wiser man was a joy to behold and a terror. This great mind has been standing behind me and quietly obeying my orders for all these years? Why? He could be so much more. But in this place the answer was plain to read. Loyalty was frequently unreasonable and illogical, and Spock had long since decided that this one aspect of his life could do without logic. I really like that part. I just really love the characterization there.
Yeah,
it's really good emotional stuff, and I can't say that I didn't feel it. I did. It's good. I mean, again, I do kind of feel like a part of me was wanting to rebel against the book a little bit sometimes because it was very, it's very cozy and sweet and nice, and I kept kind of thinking, all the trippiness was going to turn into, something horrible. And never really does. I mean, a little bit towards one point there, but, like, because it's the Enterprise crew, they can handle it, and they do, and they band together, and it's through their compassion and understanding and love of one another, and they all have, especially Jim, he has so many epiphanies and realizations, because it's mostly his perspective that we see.
Mhm.
Although, I mean, there's a little bit of others, but, like, he is kind of the focus. He's the character that's wandering around, talking to everybody. He's the one hanging out outside the ship, looking into space, and just, like, confronting it head on. He's the one making realizations about people like Spock and McCoy, and, like, thinking to himself, Spock doesn't have to be here. He could be he's writing papers on the most forward-thinking area of physics. Like, he doesn't have to be my first officer, but he chooses to be. And it's not even necessarily the logical thing to do. So, it's cool that he realizes that. And, you know, it's like the kind of thing where you feel like, I don't know, not to say that it's like the show suffers for not having that kind of thing, but I guess it is the kind of thing that you feel like it's best to explore in a novel because you're probably not going to see it on TOS. Because it's just, this show tends to be pretty plot-focused, and this book is not that necessarily.
No, it definitely isn't. Yeah.
I say plot-focused, but, like, I mean, within what you could fit in a 45-minute time slot, obviously. And it's very episodic. So, although the characters have really, really great moments together, there's never a point where, like, they have massive, deep epiphanies about one another that change everything. And you do get the feeling that this is late in the Star Trek years, like, late in the original series years, I should say.
I feel like it's more around, like, the motion picture, like, era, because it feels like they're all older, you know, like
it does.
It's like after they've returned and, like, reunited with each other.
Yeah, I mean, although this isn't something that I like to think about too much, because, like, I get annoyed when people get too focused on this stuff, I did find myself trying to place this a little bit in the Star Trek timeline, and yeah, I had put it around then too, but then I read a comment in Voyages of Imagination where she had said that, no, it's supposed to be during the 5-year mission, and so, I don't know, like, I'm a bit confused about that, too, because I do feel there are some other things that kind of point it later, too, like, Christine Chabot's, like, she's not really just a nurse anymore, she's actually got or she's working towards her doctorate, I guess she's almost got it, and so it's like she's not really, like, around anymore when McCoy wants her, and he's getting frustrated, and, like, but that might also be a reference to her not being in the 3rd season of the show very much, I don't know. Was she? I don't remember her being in too many of those episodes.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I didn't really try to tie it to any continuity with this one. Or
Yeah, I know. It's a silly thing to worry about that only fans really care about anyway. But I did find myself going, when is this? Is this after? It feels like a little later, but he's not an admiral yet. Like,
yeah. It was just like a few comments from it made me think, like, oh, this is like later than the series, maybe after the mission, or I don't know. It was just something I was trying to think of, but I mean, it doesn't really matter, I guess, that much. It was just a question that I was thinking about.
Yeah. So when did they bring in the second Enterprise exactly? Was the ship in the motion picture supposed to be the original ship? I think it was, right? Still, or was it the next Enterprise, the Enterprise A? Because they really showed off that ship.
It's been a while since I've seen the original motion picture.
Yeah.
So I can't remember.
It's been only a couple years for me, so I should remember this, and I'm sure we'll get a comment that'll say, yeah, I just can't remember now. I feel like it was another ship because they really wanted to show it off a lot. But then they destroyed it in The Search for Spock, and it was ready to be decommissioned by then anyway. So that makes me think, no, it's still the old ship, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Anyway, that's your Starship ship debate for the night. I don't think we'll get into that again.
Yeah, I mean, Star Trek is a little bit better, I think, sometimes at keeping the continuity straight than some other science fiction franchise. At least Doctor Who has the excuse of being able to go back in time and, like, change stuff, but...
Yeah, but Star Trek's been doing that lately, too.
Yeah.
That's the whole thing about these new series, right?
Like parallel universes and all that stuff, yeah.
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 They felt the need to clear up the whole thing about the eugenics wars not happening in the 1990s because people were like actually wondering about that. So yeah, I think it's more complicated than that. I think that people say what they did isn't bad, but I still haven't seen that. It's in the Strange New World series, so yeah.
Yes. Soon they are at the breach and find an entity there, a life source they want to reach and prevent from harming with the fixing of the rift. Finding themselves unable to communicate with it, Ahura realizes why. The being may not be able to communicate or have any grasp on language because it has never had anyone else to communicate with. She, with her linguistic abilities, Spock with his mind-melding abilities, and Dehenish with the Sadrau perception of time, try to bring the entity to an awareness and interact with it. The attempt results in the entity lashing out, causing the crew pain and distress, but Kirk, Scotty, and Chekhov are able to hit back. Realizing it was merely trying to defend itself and that they frightened it, the crew want to draw it back out, and Ahura, Spock, and Dehenish try again. The being, now taking on the label of the Others, responds, but readies to attack once more when they realize the crew must seal them alone in their own lifeless universe again, ripped from the awareness just granted them. McCoy is able to talk them down, however, and they begin to mournfully accept their fate when Kirk and the crew realize K'Tilk could help the Others create life in the latter's universe. After a discussion of how this new universe should work to fend off the boredom of the Others for almost eternity, Chief of Recreation Harb Tanzer suggests it be structured like a game, each round a lifetime where the Others take on mortality to play the role of singular life forms in the universe. K'Tilk structures this, but then reveals that she can't complete the universe and close the breach without staying behind, sacrificing herself. The crew, especially Scotty, who had grown very close to her, and Kirk, are distraught. But she knows she must do this to set her mistakes with the drive right. Her course of action taken, the rest of the people from the Enterprise find themselves back on the ship and their universe back to normal. They can use the drive only to get back to their own galaxy, where they are met with hundreds of Federation ships awaiting them with honors. Despite Scotty's grief over K'Tilk, he becomes excited to find ways to improve the inversion drive so it can function properly. Kirk hears this message from Scotty while holding the web structure K'Tilk gave him and drops it, but from it emerges a young Hamalki who holds the memories of K'Tilk as is capable with their offspring. And that's the end of The Wounded Sky.
Yeah. So, I mean, like I said, most of my thoughts about the book are quite positive. I do think, like, as great as the emotional stuff with the character is, and I really liked all of that, I don't necessarily think the trippiness and surreality really worked for me as much as I would have hoped. I generally like that stuff, and so I'm not sure what it is exactly. I think sometimes it maybe just like wasn't enough interaction with the environment. Like it just seemed like they were going from one thing to another, and it's like, and then Jim saw this, and then there was the other thing, and then Uhura was in a nightclub singing a song, and then you know you get like the descriptions of their minds all melded together and like all these jumbled words and everything, and like it was cool, but I'm not sure. It just didn't feel almost like it didn't go far enough or something. I'm not really sure, but I guess I was hoping that stuff would work a little better because like the idea of a really trippy exploration of like another universe and stuff like that, and being in this anentropic zone where there's no time, and I don't know, I kind of felt like it needed more something. But there were some parts that were really cool, like the description of the first jump, when Jim is like having this weird experience where suddenly he feels like the ship is sentient. I liked that a lot. And I liked many of the realizations that the characters had because of the otherworldly trippy experiences. But I guess the descriptions themselves, for me, sometimes left a little bit to be desired. But I don't know. It was still good, though. And I enjoyed the emotional reactions they all had to it and stuff. Especially Jim, obviously, because, yeah, he is the focus. Sometimes it was hard to picture William Shatner actually saying and doing some of these things. But At other times, it was kind of funny and appropriate. Like, at one point in the book, Kotoka is doing all this crazy stuff with her mind and basically shaping the universe. And again, it's very hand-wavy. Like, you don't really know what she's doing. She's just doing the thing, right? And Jim, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, like, he's been very attuned to the whole thing by then and very, like, in connection with it, and it's beautiful. But all of a sudden, he's like, that's very nice. Can we go now? This is funny. This is kind of... Yeah, I mean, I kind of get it, because, like, at that... I don't know, I think at that point, like, I really liked the first half of this book, and I really liked the idea of the surreal universe, but I guess it just didn't really connect with me as much as I was hoping it would. But otherwise, I really have no complaints about this book. Like, it was as good a Star Trek novel as I've read. And I've read, I don't know how many. I was trying to count earlier when I was going through that book, and I certainly knew a lot of titles, but there are some I thought that I had read that I could not remember a thing about. So I just can't really... Now, that's not normal for me. I usually remember at least something. And I think, again, it's just maybe the time period of Star Trek fiction I was reading at that time. Like, it just didn't seem like they were really pushing out that much. This is from before that time, and you can kind of tell because, yeah, it says a lot about the characters in a way that you feel like after this adventure, they might look at each other pretty differently.
Yeah.
You don't quite know how, but you know that, that's stated several times in the book. It's like, it's almost like, yes, being close like this is wonderful. It's really, really intimate, though. And so you're vulnerable, or if you're, like, that's going to show. And you have to be ready to open yourself up to that. And, yeah, in her book, the Enterprise crew is ready because they're all really special people. And they can handle this. And I think that's the ultimate positivity that it kind of made me feel pretty good, even when I was trying to be a little bit like, oh, that's too nice. That wouldn't like it. There should be more chaos or something like that. But a part of me was like that. And then the rest of me was going, yeah, but it's them. They're the people that can do this because it's Jim and Spock and McCoy and Scotty. And we love these characters. So that's why we go along with it. And I don't know. She convinced me. So at the end of the day, my minor criticisms are not really that significant because I think that her love of the characters always shines through. And her putting them in this situation is like the dream of Star Trek. It's like the dream you have of being inside all the heads of the Star Trek characters at once. And they all get to experience that together.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like the surrealistic scenes a fair amount. I think it was actually my favorite part of the novel. Another thing I liked about the second half is the whole debate of the ethics of playing God and introducing concepts of like death and pain to this other universe that has never really experienced any kind of existence before. And, you know, what is the moral position on doing that?
And Spock jokes about it. He's like... We are committing a violation of the Prime Directive as not even the Enterprise has previously accomplished.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At least they're aware.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I did like that too. And I was going to say, like, the whole synergistic kind of melding of beings into this gestalt creature, like, it kind of reminded me of some of Theodore Sturgeon's stuff. I don't know if anybody ever asked her if she's read some, like, I'm sure she knows about him as a Star Trek writer himself. He wrote 2 scripts, so... And a third one that was actually made into a novel. I believe it was based on notes from him, because I don't think he completed it, but somebody else completed it. It's called the... Oh, what is it? The Joy Machine. And it was apparently a script for TOS that got quite far along, but never got produced, so...
His episodes, it's Amok Time, right? And what's the second one?
Yeah, Shore Leave on Amok Time, yeah.
Okay, Shore Leave, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I was reminded of that as well, because in that episode, they're on this planet, and they're, like, they've been in space for a really long time, and it's like, it's, you know, we have to hang out on this nice-looking planet and take a bit of a holiday. And it turns out that whatever they're thinking about in their heads manifests in reality. And that's exactly what happens in the barrier universe there, like the pre-created universe.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a little different, but pretty much, yeah, whatever they're thinking comes to pass. And in the episode, it's like basis for conflict. And at one point, like, McCoy is thinking about a tiger or something like that, and Jim's like, Bones, don't think it! Don't think it! And of course, that makes it even worse. And so this, like, massive
and Bones
tiger
dies. McCoy dies because of a knight, like, stabbing him through the chest. It's very... It's more related to that third inversion jump, when everything kind of goes to chaos. That's more along the lines of what happens in Shore Leave.
Yeah. You know, obviously there was a few episodes. The other one was Where No Man Has Gone Before episode, which obviously the episode that she co-wrote of Next Generation, which we're going to talk about a little, was kind of based on a similar model. And some of the season 1 TNG episodes are like that. Like there's The Naked Now versus The Naked Time, and Where No One Has Gone Before versus Where No Man Has Gone Before, which is where they penetrate this barrier on the edge of the galaxy or something and get to this area where these two psychics on the ship start to have an inordinate amount of power because it resonates with whatever area of space they're in. So again, you can kind of see the similarities in all these concepts, but it's all very Star Trek, right? So there's some fun anachronisms, like weird anachronisms in the book. Like at one point, McCoy mentions telling somebody the riot act, which I thought was pretty funny. It's like, did they still know what that is? I guess so. I mean, it seems like it's a funny thing to say. And at another point, they mention Lloyd's of London. Apparently, that's still around in the 23rd. I guess they might not have said that if the book had been written 10 or 15 years later, because although I think it is still around, it went through a whole lot of litigation trouble in the 1990s and almost disappeared for good, I believe.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, in the 23rd century, they're giving out a prize to aliens, which is pretty cool. Yeah. Anybody catch the Doctor Who reference?
Which one?
Towards the end of the book, Jim is looking for the sonic screwdriver.
Oh yeah, no, I do remember that, because it's Tanzer. Tanzer's trying to use it. I wasn't sure if that was... I assume it is intentional, because...
it has to be
I do know... And especially Duane has talked about Doctor Who before, and actually on her blog has, like, written some, like, fun, silly, like, fan fiction for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, often science fiction and genre fans, you know, they like a lot of that stuff, and
sure,
we see that in a lot of the writers of this kind of stuff, as they do move around between the different properties and the things that they like, and they write stuff for them. It doesn't always get published, but if it doesn't, it can go up on the fan fiction sphere, which I mean,
it's always been super active with Star Trek, that's for sure. I mean, as we saw in our last episode, since pretty much the beginning in the 1960s, as people were writing this stuff.
The references I had caught is at one point they mention, when talking about what to do for recreation, they mention Fizbin, the fake card game that Kirk creates in Piece of the Action. I guess that is a real game, perhaps, which is very funny to think about.
It is, yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of cute things like that in this book, and again, like, a part of me gets cynical about that sometimes, but I don't know, she was always able to win me over in the end. Like, you know, in the end, they come back to our galaxy, and, like, there's all the whole fleet's out there, and, like, at first I thought something sinister was going to happen. You know, this is the end, getting towards the very end of the book, so it didn't seem likely, but I was like, are they in the deepest trouble imaginable now? Like, but no, they're all just come to say hi, and they're all happy for them. Even though they don't really know that they destroyed 2 or 3 stars.
No, I think they corrected that, so that I don't think happened in...
Oh, yeah, I guess. Or did they? That was in our universe, though.
Yeah, I think that Catil used creative physics to repair the novas,
I guess,
or something like that.
Yeah, very creative physics.
Yeah. It's an appropriate name for it, for sure.
Yeah.
It's so creative physics that nobody understands it. Not even the person who made it, let alone the writer. Or us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I have no room to complain because I'm not, like, a science person, so
Yeah.
even if this could be explained fully in an entire giant supplemental volume, it's not like I would understand it anyway. But it just did seem kind of hand-wavy. It's this magical thing that can basically do anything you want it to, and I don't know, sometimes that doesn't really... it feels too convenient, but again, plot's not really the point of this book,
exactly.
so I don't really feel like... Even though I exist for conflict, so when I have these conflicting viewpoints in my head, I'm like, I'm not really sure which one's on top. But generally, yeah, I think it's positive in this case, and I like the way that she handled all of that stuff. But it's just, like it is very magical, and it's not even like nowadays when people say magical, they think of these epic fantasy things that. Yeah, there's magic, but it has to follow all these rules. It's meticulously laid out by the author, so if he does magic, it can't contradict any of the rules in the system. And Diane Duane's basically like, I don't know how she is in the Young Wizards, but here she's basically like, screw all that. My sorcery is omnipotent. And so, that's the way it is.
Yeah.
As someone who doesn't really get regular science quite often, I don't have as much of a problem with it myself. It definitely seems to do a lot of work that maybe it does have a hand-wavy feeling to it, but not in a way that I really mind that much. And the conversations that come out of it, this more like philosophical sort of fantastic conversations, I think are pretty fun. So I enjoy it. I don't really have an issue with that as much.
Yeah, I think it works here.
Yeah.
That's cool. I don't have that much of an issue, and it was nice to read a Star Trek book again.
Yeah, no, this is definitely a good choice.
I think I read my last Star Trek book in like 1995 or something, so it's been a while.
Yeah.
Nate, you've never read one before. Gretchen, you've read a fair amount, a number at this point, right?
I've read about a dozen, more or less. It's been mostly TOS and Deep Space Nine, but I have a couple of Enterprise novels under my belt as well.
Yeah.
I own quite a few just because my cousin, who was a big Star Trek fan, gifted me a whole bunch of like extras that he had, so I do want to get around to most of those at some point. I have yet to read a number of TNG and a few Voyager that I have as well. I have not read any from those two series yet.
I've only read TOS and TNG books so far, so and like I said, it's been a while. It seems like just when I was starting to get out of it is when it started to get more like the book started to push a little harder. There were one or two TNG books in particular, I think written by Peter David, who's a pretty prominent Star Trek author, and I feel like he was trying to be a little more than the other Star Trek novels I'd read at that time. There were a lot of novels that they seemed to exist mostly to fill in gaps, like what's Jim Kirk's father, what was his first mission on his, because he apparently served on the Enterprise too. And that's one thing that always made me laugh about Star Trek is that when somebody's in Starfleet, usually their kids want to join Starfleet too. That's just the way it goes. The best job in town, right? But yeah, Deep Space Nine, again, shook up that formula a little bit with Jake definitely not wanting to be a part of it, right? So that was cool.
He wanted to be a writer.
Yeah.
A pretty good one, too.
Yeah, I mean, I want to check out maybe some of the DS9 ones. One I want to check out is the one by Andrew Robinson, which is all about Cardassia. So yeah, sometimes you get weird things like that in the TV tie-in stuff too, where actors write their own books, and sometimes they're actually good.
Yeah, I know Dark Shadows, that's definitely the case there, where the actress that plays Angelique wrote a whole bunch of Dark Shadows novels.
Cool.
I know, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I wonder if Barnabas Collins wrote some.
I don't believe he did, but
Oh,
yeah, there's a fair amount of those novels out there.
that's cool. I've never actually watched Dark Shadows, but I know a little bit about it. I've listened to some Dark Shadows audios, and yeah. Which of the movie versions is it? House of the...
House of Dark Shadows,
House of Dark Shadows? That's worth watching? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I know that series has a lot of novels, too.
Oh, tons, yeah. Yeah, definitely a lot. Yeah.
And it seems like that's usually the pattern, is like, while the show's on TV, yeah, maybe not much, but afterwards, people want more, so it's a perfect opportunity to spread the license around and have a little fun with it.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's what was happening in Star Trek in the early 80s.
Yeah.
Until the dark time of 1985. Yeah, I don't know. It's just obviously, it comes across in that book like it was pretty universally like thought of that way, but there's still some good books from that time period, obviously. But the writers, it seemed like they were using the same staple of writers a lot of the time, and every so often there'd be a new person, but generally, yeah, there's a lot of names that I recognize, but not all of them from sci-fi writing. Some of them they probably came out of the fan fiction community. So, as with the Doctor Who stuff, it does seem like a good opportunity for writers to get their foot in the door.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, the author we talked about last time turned her fan fiction into a published novel, and did a couple official Star Trek works. Yeah, definitely a strong bridge there between the two. And I guess in Duane's case, that also led to a TV co-writing credit and a somewhat adaptation of this novel in a season 1 Next Generation episode.
Yeah. Well, why don't we talk about that a bit? We've all seen it, right?
Yeah.
At one point, at least? Yeah.
Yeah, I just watched it recently.
Yeah, I just watched it earlier today to refresh my memory of it.
Yeah. So, pretty good episode. I definitely think that it made me laugh a few times. Like, it was, I don't know, it's just sometimes unintentional comedy a little bit, and like the way certain things are portrayed. And yeah, so one of the things that Gene Roddenberry introduced on the show that everybody seems to hate is Wesley Crusher, and I never thought that was entirely fair, but I get how, especially in the first season, he seems kind of annoying, as generally the children on the ship do, I'm afraid.
I never really liked Wesley as a character, but this is definitely a big Wesley episode.
Well, I mean, I certainly don't mind the character later on, but here it's like, he's like pretty much Gene Roddenberry's stand-in as a young kid, so...
Yeah. And he's chosen. He's the one. He's the genius.
Yes, exactly. So, Roddenberry's real name is Eugene Wesley Roddenberry, by the way.
Right.
So, it's very, very deliberate. And he and Will Wheaton had many talks together, so... the whole idea of playing the character. So yeah, like that whole thing was really funny. And yeah, that whole like alien. So they replaced a lot of the alien stuff with somewhat less alien seeming stuff in the TV version. And the Traveler, who's the stand-in for Katoka, is, well, pretty much takes Captain Picard aside and is like, this boy, Wesley, is going to be the greatest thing to the future of your civilization. Yeah. You must nurture him. And
it's like he's going to be for science what Beethoven was for music.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can't tell him, by the way. You can't tell him about all this because it'll give him a big head. Which they undid that later because Wesley obviously knows about it at some point on the show. So I guess his mom probably told him. So.
Yeah.
I have news for you, Wesley. I'll never tell you to shut up again. But why don't we talk about the germination a little bit?
At the time when TNG was first starting, I think it was only writers that were in the Writers Guild and like had some credits under their belt that could actually write for the series.
So they had to have live TV experience.
Yes, that's right. Yes, she had like animated series done, but no live action experience at that time. But Michael Reeves, who wrote it with her, he had experience and actually wanted to do an episode, but it was very similar to Wounded Sky, and asked if she would co-write it with him and like help him pitch it to the TNG crew. And they sent in, I believe it was 2 drafts, and then after the second draft they heard nothing from the studio and found out they had just been barred from working on it after that point. And most of the things that were in their original scripts were changed. They did not have, as Diane Duane likes to call him, the alien in the pajamas. She would not have someone dressed in pajamas. But the only 2 things that remained, I think she said it was the scene with Picard and his mother, which was Michael Reeves's contribution, and the scene when the turbolift doors open and it's just the void outside of it. That was what Duane wrote as sort of a reference to like her own work. And it was nominated for an Emmy, which meant that they had to be nominated along for it, which they were very happy about. But, it wasn't nominated. It was suggested to be a nomination, but it did not end up getting nominated.
Still cool, though.
Yeah, the turbo lift into the void scene is really cool and really well done. And I agree. The
cool.
Traveler is very silly compared to Cthulhu. Even though it's obviously couldn't depict something like a translucent spider alien with the Next Generation budget. Just, I don't know. Some of the four-head aliens in Next Generation look better than the others, and the Traveler just isn't one of their better makeup creations.
Yeah,
I don't know.
He doesn't really have much of a personality either.
Yeah,
He's just kind of like meek and sort of weirdly. Apparently, the actor was in the running to play Data originally, so that could have been different.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He reminds me a lot of. I can't think of the name of the alien, but the one that's like the servant of Troy, Loaxana Troy.
Right,
that's what he reminds me of quite a bit. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I see. Okay. Yeah, I guess he talked kind of similar, too.
Yeah.
It's cool that you bring that up about the Void thing, because, although I do remember that, it was a pretty quick scene. And in general, I do think, as much as I criticized the surreal stuff in the book, in the episode, it's just kind of silly. It's not really... I don't know.
The sense of, mystical strangeness is really absent from the episode. They play it much more literal and less kind of dreamlike, like a lot of the book scenes play out to be. And again, there's probably practical reasons for doing so, but I think it does lessen it a bit. And the one character they introduce who I guess is supposed to be the Traveler's boss, but it's really the other way around. It's just kind of insufferable.
Oh, he's totally insufferable.
Who was, as Duane said, was not what they had intended. No, I believe he was supposed to be Picard's, former, college friend or, academy friend or something. I think she said along the lines of that. And then he was changed to be just an insufferable jerk of a man.
Yeah. And I know they wrote him that way, but it just, it makes the episode hard to watch sometimes. Some of those scenes, it's oh man, I just wish this guy wasn't here.
Yeah.
I call that kind of character a Boohis character.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes they can be kind of fun, and I definitely think those kind of characters, TNG has a lot of them.
Yeah.
TOS does too. That Colonel guy in the Doomsday Machine, he's the perfect example of a Boohis character. Everything he says is wrong. And it's the actor knows it, because he talks in this way that's I don't think you should be commanding this ship! And it's that kind of voice.
Yeah. I feel like in Star Trek, whenever there's any person who's of a higher rank than the captain, that is whether it's Kirk or Picard, they're usually supposed to be a Boohis character most often of the time.
And Doctor Who had these kind of characters too, especially in the Pertwee era. They're usually these either military guys who try and go over don't like Lefford Stewart, or they're official political guys who are just Julio, England for the English, and making fun of those kind of people.
Yeah.
And you're not supposed to like them or even feel. But I don't know. I think by the end you do kind of feel bad for this guy a little bit, but it's not it's just personal. It's not really. I don't know. The show doesn't really convey anything about him. He just pretty much falls from grace and admits very quietly, "Oh, I guess it was him all along, and I was just in denial." And and it's interesting that Duane I guess Duane and Reeve knew that they would have to not have the alien spider. So their solution to that was that they actually made him, that guy, Kaczynski, do all the stuff. So they had originally planned for him to be a very sympathetic character. That for some reason afterwards, they introduced this other alien who just complicated things, pretty much. It's it would have been cool if Picard's friend was responsible for all that stuff.
Right.
So at the end of the episode 2, I think they're supposed to, in their original script, they were supposed to actually create a new universe. So it's supposed to be part of the thing. So again, that's much closer to the book.
Yeah, that's all dropped from the TNG episode. The whole other life form universe type thing.
Yeah.
And all because of office politics, basically.
Right, yeah. I mean, yeah.
Right.
I mean, I'd imagine there was a
Yeah.
lot of that, and especially during the early days of the show when they were just kind of
Yeah, it
figuring out
sounds
what they
like it.
want to do and getting the whole thing off the ground.
Yeah, and then you had the Roddenberry camp who was trying to push things and like keep things a certain way and like make it his show again, kind of thing. And then you had the people on the other side who were, I guess, wanting to do their own thing more. And obviously, I don't know. It sounds a little bit stressful, and I can see why even the actors don't really look fondly upon that time.
Right.
Mm.
Right.
So, and I think that colors how the audience thinks of it too. Like, I always defend it, but I get it. It's a little bit,
Yeah.
at times. And yeah, this is the most Wesley of all Wesley episodes, pretty much. Like, just that last scene. Oh my god.
Yeah. Yeah. They laid on
It's
really
really
thick.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't, it doesn't bother me. It doesn't, like, really piss me off, but it's just kind of funny, right? Like,
Yeah.
I just, I kind of don't really believe in putting something down for not always being ideal. So it's just, doing the Wesley Crusher, Mary Sue and all that. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's just that.
Yeah. I mean, I know that a lot of people hate Wesley, but I mean, I've never felt that much dislike towards him.
Yeah.
I'm pretty indifferent towards him most of the time, but this is the episode where if you don't like him, you absolutely will hate him.
Exactly. Yeah. He is obviously, like, Gene's attempt specifically to appeal to the young boys in the audience who, I mean, I say boys exclusively, but I guess I don't necessarily just mean that. I mean, I don't know that that's necessarily what he was thinking, but to appeal to them and make them see that, if you study math, if you study physics and stuff like that, you could be as cool as this guy. But I don't know, I guess it kind of backfired a little bit, but gotta hand him the attempt at least.
Right.
It was pretty good, so.
The updated version of Hugo Gernsback's view of the world.
Yeah. So among the scary stuff that happens, Captain Picard sees an orchestra. There's some ballerina dancing. Oh, no! And a guy randomly catches fire.
Yeah.
That's pretty bad.
Yeah.
He's not an important character.
There is a Targ there that Worf sees, and
The Targ is pretty cute.
it is cute. And he is okay with Tasha calling it like a kitty cat, which
Yeah.
is kind of nice. Duane actually said in one of her posts that she wished that she had thought of the Targ. She did like that.
Yeah. It's a nice addition.
Yeah. Oh, that would be pretty cool and scary, actually, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't be cool if you were in the elevator, but... yeah. I guess it doesn't quite measure up to Jim standing on the outside of his ship, staring out into space and musing on how basically the Enterprise is crewed by, raving xenophiles. But
Right.
but that scene definitely wasn't going for a little frisson of chills and horror, so I don't know. Yeah. So it's not bad, though. I mean, I enjoyed the episode somewhat. Like, the fact that it made me laugh was kind of cool. So...
Yeah, it's definitely one
Yeah.
of the better season 1 TNG episodes, but I think definitely overall the book was far better.
Yeah.
And certainly I like the book a lot.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the first tie-in novels I read for Star Trek was Doctor's Orders by Duane, and I really loved that one as well, which is why I wanted to cover this one, because, I wanted to read more of Duane, and why not start with the first one that she did, and I'm really glad this is the one I chose, because I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely a good choice.
Yeah, great choice. Definitely. If it had been just me and Nate doing this episode, I really would have been in the dark about what to choose, because when it comes to Star Trek novels, I guess maybe I would choose one or two TNG books that I remember quite liking, but I don't know. Yeah, it's definitely, and I mean, we'll get to that when we talk about Doctor Who in a moment, but it's definitely hard to pick out, because, I mean, we are a literature podcast, and I think it's much better if we enjoy stuff, right? And we are in an area where, there's a lot of prose fiction that's maybe not, I don't know, it doesn't really work as well as standalone fiction as some of the other stuff we've done on the podcast does. So just picking something that stands out on its own merits is a bit of a challenge sometimes if you don't know your way around. I don't know what the right term is. the landscape, I guess. So yeah, this is definitely the best. I don't know. I'm going to say it's one of the best Star Trek novels that I've read, but it's been so long that I probably can't categorically say anything like that, but I definitely recommend it if you're a Star Trek fan.
Yeah.
If you're not a Star Trek fan, you might not get that much from it. I don't know. That's the other thing with these kind of books, right?
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
and I actually do think that is not a bad evaluation in a way. I mean, it's kind of cruel because you have to look at it from a non-fan perspective, and I think that I like Star Trek enough to say that, yeah, I'm probably a fan. I mean, I know a fair bit about it, and I like talking about it, and it makes me want to watch it. But you're going to look at something like, if somebody just like found this book in a box somewhere and they picked it up and read it, would they like it? Assuming they weren't familiar with the show. And I do think like striving for that makes sense in a way, right? Because then you know that the book can stand on its own merits. But I think a lot of authors of tie-in fiction maybe aren't that interested in that. I mean, especially it sounds kind of snobbish, but especially if they come from the fan fiction background, like, they love the world that they're in so much, and that's what they want to talk about.
Yeah, and I think that's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, for a novel like this, it's really the fans that are going to be reading it anyways. So,
Yeah.
I don't really have a problem with that.
Yeah, me neither. I mean, any sort of extended universe stuff like that. I mean, it is for the fans. That's who they expect their writing for. That's the audience they're intending. So as long as the fans enjoy it, and that's sort of what I think matters to them and what should matter, really.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Agreed.
I think as far as, a fan of Star Trek, I think this is a great book to read.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, likewise. So
I guess, unless you guys have anything else, shall we take a quick break and move on to our next major science fiction franchise?
Yeah, sounds good.
So let's switch gears and talk about something with a very different set of, I guess, restrictions that are based a lot less on the world that you happen to be in, and more on a very specific character and their specific modus operandi, if you want to call it that. We're going to talk about Doctor Who.